Chevreuse is the brand new Pyro 4-star added to Genshin for version 4.3. Leading up to her launch, she's had very mixed perceptions, with some people fearing that her restrictions will make her too niche and practically useless, while other people think she'll be the second coming of Kazuha. So which is it? Well, I've been testing Chevreuse for the past 6 hours straight, using her with every Pyro and Electro team I could possibly think of. And overall, I think she's good at C0 and great at C6. Let's talk about why and how to get the most out of her if you decide to build her. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Chevreuse can be played either as an off-field support or as a hybrid support and quick swap damage dealer. When using her for her supportive role, she is relatively cheap to build and does not require very high investment to get her up and running, which I think is a huge pro if you just want to try her out. Her skill is the main part of her kit, dealing a decent amount of damage, but more importantly, if you use her hold mode and an overloaded reaction has been triggered somewhere on your team, she launches an overcharged ball, which not only does more damage, but activates both of her passive. The first, reducing both pyro and electro resistance by 40%, which is a lot. That's as much as Viridis and Venerer. The good thing about this is that as long as someone on the team is triggering an overloaded reaction, the buff can stay refreshed even when she's fully off field. That means you have permanent uptime on this buff as long as you have decent pyro and electro application. At least every 6 seconds, both of the elements are being applied. Launching an overcharged ball also grants an attack buff, which is up to a 40%, which is pretty big. It's no Bennett, but it's a pretty solid buff. If you're using her at C0, or if you don't have any field time for her personal damage, I recommend maxing out her HP to get the max buff. If you do have field time, then it can be worth building her for damage, and only if she's C4+. So that's a good thing for if you just want to get her up and running as a support, but also if you really love this character and you want to see her do big numbers, or if you have rotation time to fill, such as using her with a unit like Yai, or even Raiden, who has a bit of uptime flexibility, and you have a high constellation, then using her skill for damage is really, really good. You guys probably already know this, but her passives, which are the main point of playing her, at least the resistance to reduction passive, only works when pyro and electro characters are on the team. So that's definitely her biggest downside, is that you can't use the strongest element in the game, which is hydro. You can't use animo. I do think that the other parts of her kit make up for that though, because it essentially replaces Vivi on the team, but it makes her really a character that's specific to bossing, and it makes her somewhat restricted in the comps that feel great for her. But I still think that there's enough comps that do feel really good that she still ends up being a pretty solid character at C0 and quite a good character at C6. Like I said, at C0, she's more than capable of being a great buffer, but once you get to C4, you will be able to use her skill 3 times, which means that her personal damage can go way up. I was able to see 50, 60, 70k shots with her skill, which was fantastic. It was quick, bursty damage. As long as you have the rotation space, it's amazing. The other notable constellation is at C6, where not only on top of the other buffs and debuffs that she gives additional healing, and more importantly, gives a 20% pyro and electro damage bonus, which lasts for 8 seconds, which is not going to be permanent uptime on your off-field characters, but will at least give some boosts. And 20% pyro damage is about on par with what Kazuha's damage percent gives, meaning that her total buffing at C6 is actually higher than Kazuha, while also giving an additional attack buff. So now that we are familiar with her kit, let's talk about her team. Starting with a pretty cool 4-star only team, using Fischl, Chevreuse, Bennett, and Xiangling was actually quite good. The more invested your Bennett, Xiangling, and Chevreuse are, the better. I tried this team both at Constellation 0 and C6 Chevreuse. With C0, you definitely need a really invested Bennett to make this team work, and I much preferred it at C6 when I could actually use the field time that was freed up for the full shots of Chevreuse. But the next thing I did was switch out Fischl for Yai, and this team felt amazing. I think it's possible that this is Yai's best team for a lot of content. I think Dendro is still amazing for her, and it's totally possible, especially if you vertically invest into Dendro, like if you have Nahida's C2 or something, then it won't even be close. But I think that this team competes, at least in single target content, it competes very, very closely with Yai's teams. You can also swap Xiangling for Fischl here. Both options are great. With Fischl, you're going to get a bit more burst, so I really like this a lot. I was really impressed by how the team fared with Linny. It's definitely pretty scary to not use a shielder, but if you can can stomach it, man, the damage was insane. The clears were extremely fast. It was actually my very fastest clear I've ever gotten on the perpetual mechanical array, but it also did require a lot of reset to do. But I thought Linny was great. I also used Klee on this team. This felt great as well. It didn't clear as fast as Linny because Linny's front load is just absurd, and Klee really excels in AoE. So trading out Kazuha for Chevreuse isn't like the greatest thing in the world, because in AoE it's not so great. Chevreuse is definitely meant to be a bossing unit. Like Overloaded has horrible anti-synergy with AoE content for the most part, unless it's immovable AoE content. But for trash mobs, like, you want to run a grouper like Kazuha, and you can't run a grouper when you're running Chevreuse, so it just makes sense to not use her in groupable content. That's just the reality of the situation. I also tried Yoimiya variations. This team felt pretty good as well. It definitely didn't feel as good as Vaporize, but it felt pretty good. I also did Dea on this team. It felt pretty bad because Dea things. I tried Hu Tao on this team. This felt pretty decent. Definitely felt better to vape Hu Tao's stuff, but it still was decent. I also swapped out Bennett for Xiangling on all of these teams, so I tried, not all of these teams, but I tried it with Hu Tao, and this performed pretty closely to the Bennett version. Not quite as good, but pretty closely. I also did Raiden in this slot without Bennett. I don't recommend going without Bennett unless you have C6 Chevreuse. If you have C6, then it's actually pretty comparable. Like, I did C6 Chevreuse with this team, and it was actually really quite close to Bennettless teams. The ER is much less of an issue on Raiden teams, of course. If you only have C0 Chevreuse, I definitely do recommend sticking to Bennett. I also tried the Xiangling variant for Raiden with Xiangling Bennett. I didn't like the Fischl one nearly as much. Don't recommend doing Fischl with Bennett because you're gonna lose a lot of pyro uptime. It's really important when you're team building that you're getting at least a decent amount of pyro off field or on field, but you're getting some form of pyro, whether your rotations are flexible enough, like with Yai, that you can run this team and you can switch back to Bennett here and there to get a skill to refresh Overloaded, or if you're running an on-field pyro character to make Overloaded, or you have to be running Xiangling. If you're going to be doing something like this, you're just going to run out of pyro off field, and so the team feels it was still okay, but it was definitely subpar compared to the other variant. One thing that I didn't get to try that I really want to is a Razor variation, where you build Razor as a hybrid electro and pyro character. I hope someone with an invested Razor and who happens to get a C6 Chevreuse tries this, because I don't have any talent for Razor, and the talents weren't available by the time I was ready to actually farm them. And I think there's a couple funny things you could do, because Chevreuse does give a damage bonus. You could do like a double attack goblet with Razor, or you could build for one of the elemental damages or the other, because if you have C6 Bennett, then you're going to be infusing your attacks with pyro. So if you do double attack, both your pyro and your electro hits are going to be buffed, and so it's like it's the first dual element carry is what this team would be. You could either go for Xiangling or for Fischl here. Either one would be fine, because Razor is going to be providing both electro and pyro. I have no idea if this team would be any good at all, but I think it sounds really, really funny. So I hope someone is able to try it out, and we can see. Maybe Zajef, but I don't think Zajef will get C6 Chevreuse, so I don't know who is going to try this out, but I hope someone does and links it to me. This was actually Flip's idea, so despite being a Chevreuse hater, he gave the coolest idea for a team, so yay Flip. I did try Sino as well. It wasn't awful. Yeah, that's all I can kind of say. It wasn't awful. I definitely wouldn't wish I only did it at C6, and it was relatively close to his Dendro teams, but it wasn't great. It was noticeably worse, and definitely had big energy issues, but it was usable for sure. I unfortunately didn't get to Diluc. I don't have a full Crimson Witch set, but I think similar to Yoimiya and Hu Tao, like, I think he's gonna suffer quite a bit from not being able to vape. Same with Yanfei. I also did try Keqing. This is definitely her best non-Dendro team, but it definitely didn't feel as good as the Yaimiko team. I also tried a dual DPS with Keqing and Yaimiko. I didn't like that much either. Overall, it was not bad, but it definitely felt like Keqing was getting carried on this team. Throughout all of this, I also went back and forth between using Chevreuse as that quick swap DPS and actually doing damage, as well as just being a support. And I tried her both with the deathmatch and with Homa, and she felt surprisingly impactful with her damage. Again, if you have the field time and if you have the investment to spare, then it's definitely worth building her for damage. So yeah, overall, my favorite teams were definitely the Yaimiko ones and the Raiden ones and the Linny ones. I think those three sort of stand above the rest, but I think it's pretty cool that even with a 4-star only team, it still performs very well. I think a lot of people are wondering how she performs with Rational. I mean, the jury's still out, right? It's hard to test. It's hard to say for sure. At C0, it felt slightly behind find C6 Xingqiu in this slot, and at C6 it felt noticeably better. That's only from 1 day of testing, so that's not me saying that this is a better team or Raiden's best team, but it is a good, and it could be better than Rational. One thing I unfortunately did not get to try was C6 Kujo Sara, because I do not have C6 Kujo Sara, and before C6 she's awful. So my understanding, I feel like this has to be worse than with Xiangling in this slot. I wonder if you can put Xiangling in the Bennett slot. I don't know. I would love to see people test it out. I'll test it out myself, hopefully, if I can get C6 Chevreuse and C6 Kujo Sara on this banner, but that's something that the jury is still out on. I think for bossing, if I was to throw my hat into the ring, I'm going to say that this has a chance of outperforming Kazuha. I think it will. If I'm going to throw my hat in the ring, I think that this will outperform Kazuha for speed runs, for single boss chambers. Chevreuse just does more buffing and it's more consistent, especially if you're doing multi-wave scenarios. Although in multi-wave you will need some pyro, so maybe you do want Xiangling. I'm not sure. The jury's still out on this one with how she works with Kujo Sara, and I know everyone's dying for it, but I just don't have C6. The other thing I didn't get to test a lot of was Beidou, because this abyss is awful for Beidou. Both sides of the abyss start with a single target boss, and even if you get through it, the next chambers aren't that much better. You have to go to the second half of the second side to even get anything remotely close to being Beidou friendly. So, but I do think that this team would be quite good. You get lots of, especially with C6 Chevreuse, you get lots of field time for Chevreuse. You have good AoE, but it's going to be good when Nilou is good. So not groupable enemies, just those ungroupable enemies, because otherwise Overload is going to feel too bad. Before we leave teams, I do want to talk about a couple things you probably shouldn't do. So you'll notice I haven't talked about Kuki at all. Some people are saying that you can use Kuki. Kuki has no synergy with Chevreuse. Chevreuse provides healing, but what the team needs is more damage and more buffing. So yes, you can run Kuki for EM overloads, but Chevreuse doesn't buff overloaded. She buffs damage of pyro and electro characters. So you still need to build your characters for damage. Overloaded damage is still going to be the same. It's sort of bait. You need to proc overloaded, but you don't actually do damage with the overloaded reaction. Similar thing for Toma. Like, sure, if you're using a character like Yoimiya, you can use Toma on the team, but it's just going to be such a loss compared to Bennett that because you don't like what Chevreuse provides the defensive utility that Bennett does, especially when you get to C6. Like, the healing is actually quite good, like very good. It's when it's the attack buff that she's missing. So if you're not going to run Bennett, you run other characters that give damage or that give buffing, and there just aren't that many. Like, Toma doesn't give damage or buffing, right? Jinyan doesn't, Amber doesn't. Oh, I forgot to talk about Yanfei. My Yanfei isn't built yet, but Yanfei should perform similarly to Yoimiya. She's a 4-star, so her multiplier has to be lower. She'll be, as usual, it'll be more comfy. In general, like characters like Yanfei, characters like Yoimiya, characters like Hu Tao, Diluc, these are characters that do a big chunk of their damage from vaporizing. So not being able to vaporize really hurts their damage. And although Chevreuse does, especially at C6, go a long way to make up for that, it's not enough to quite get you there. It's characters that like Linny that really quite shine, because he does a lot of personal damage and Chevreuse buffs his personal damage. So if your Linny is really well invested like mine was, you can get crazy clears. Moving on to build guide. You do not need to level 90 this character unless you just want to max her out and use her as a DPS. I level 90'd her because I was on the test server, so I was able to easily level 90 her, but in general, leave her at level 80, especially if you're just using her as a support. I would definitely leave her at level 80 unascended. But if you are going to build her and use her for DPS, like obviously eventually level 90, but she's especially if she's using Bennett, especially if you're not like super investing in her, like she's just a sub DPS at the end of the day, so I would save your books and leave her at 80. For your talents, definitely her skill. Well, the thing is, both of her talents, her skill is more important than her burst in general, because that's what's going to be doing the healing. Like overall, she can definitely replace Bennett in terms of healing. It's just the attack buffing that's not as easily replaced. So yeah, the skill is both damage and healing. The burst is just damage. So you can actually get away with leaving her talents at 0/0 if you are using her on a Bennett team as a support. If you start to use her and need the healing more, like on a Bennett-less team or as a DPS, then you start to want that higher investment. For weapons in general, I think Fav is going to be your best choice, especially as a support. As a DPS, it's all the usual suspects. Staff of Homa, Deathmatch, Jadewing Spear, they're all going to be good. But yeah, I haven't seen like calcs for Chevreuse personal damage yet, but I'm sure it's going to be the usual suspects. I think Homa is the best in slot for DPS because it gives you that extra HP for that extra attack buff, and then it gives you attack based on that HP. So Homa is just kind of perfect for her. It's like the perfect, it's match made in heaven. But I use Deathmatch Deathmatch, and that was good too. The drip is insane with Deathmatch. But Jade Wing Spear is going to be fine as a stat stick. I suppose if you're building for burst damage, you could use the catch, but kind of copium. But yeah, it's sort of just the usual DPS weapons that you're used to. You can look up a weapon ranking or look at my guides for like any DPS polearm character if you want to know DPS. And if you're using support, just go Fav. If you don't have Fav, I guess prototype Starglitter. I don't know. There aren't that many other options other than Fav for support. She doesn't use the passive at all. It's just for the ER. So yeah. For artifact, if no one else on the team is running Noblesse, then you want to run Noblesse. But often Bennett will be running Noblesse on those teams, and you might want to run her on a healing set like Clam. Yeah, Clam, or that new set from the new domain. If you happen to have it, definitely don't go farm it for her. Even if you use Clam, it's not like she's going to be doing tons of Clam damage. It's free damage, and there's nothing really better for her to run, so you might as well. You could also put Bennett on Clam, I guess, but kind of weird. But either one's fine. And if you're using for damage, I think just two-piece is probably your best bet. Two-piece Crimson, two-piece Hack, maybe two-piece Golden Troop, maybe four-piece Golden Troop. No, I wouldn't use four-piece Golden Troop because you're gonna lose that four-piece effect, because you're probably gonna have her on the field for more than 2 seconds if you're doing her for damage. So yeah, just two-piece is gonna be the way to go. For substats, I found that I generally did need to go ER Sand or have an ER weapon to get her burst consistently. You don't always need to get her burst consistently, but if you're using Noblesse, then you do obviously want to have your burst up consistently. And if you're using her C6, you also want to get her burst up consistently, or not her C6, her C4, to use her triple charge shot, because you need to use her burst to actually get it. So if you have enough substats, you might not need to run ER. I found I did, but I didn't have that many substats. So it also depends on the team. If you're getting lots of pyro energy, if you have time to funnel Bennett's skill, then you can definitely get away without ER. Obviously, attack would be better if you can. For Goblet, it just depends if you're going full support or if you're doing damage. Pyro damage if you're doing damage, and HP if you're going support. Similar for the Circlet, crit, or HP, depending how you're building. I did want to give a couple gameplay tips for her rotations, because her rotations can be a little bit clunky. And so rather than going through, I mean, they're not clunky, but you have to, well, they can be. But rather than going through each rotation of each team, I'm going to teach you the things they need to know, how to construct your rotation yourself. So the most important thing is to create an overloaded reaction on the team before she uses her skill. So you have to look at your team and decide, how is that going to happen? Usually by the second rotation, it's not a big deal at all. But on the first rotation, you have to make sure you do it right. The second thing is, if you're using her with units that snapshot buff, such as Shangling, her burst, what snapshot means is it takes all the attack buffs that are given to that character at that time, and it keeps them throughout the whole duration. And if buffs would be added later, it doesn't get those. It just gets the ones that were there when you first started that burst. So Shangling is like this, Fischl is like this. Yaimiko is not like this. Her buffs are flexible. They get added to or taken away, so it doesn't matter what hers are. So that means, let's say we're using my favorite Chevreuse team with Yaimiko or Raiden, or let's just go with Yaimiko. I want to start with Yaimiko, and then if I were to just use Chevreuse's skill neck, then I wouldn't get the buff uptime, because I need the overloaded to happen before I use the skill. So I need to burst first with Chevreuse, then I need to use her skill, then I can use Bennett's burst, then his skill, and then Shangling, and then Shangling will get snapshot both Bennett's buff and Chevreuse buff. Now, if I'm using C6 Chevreuse, or C4 Chevreuse, and I'm wanting to use her sub DPS damage and use her as a quick swap with the triple E, then I actually need to start with Bennett. So I need to do Yaimiko first, then I need to do Bennett, probably his skill, then his burst. Then I've already procced an overloaded reaction from using Bennett. So now I can go back to Chevreuse, use her burst, then her skill, then her triple skill, then Shangling, then Yaimiko, right? So that's always how you want to be thinking about the rotation. On this team, it's actually best to start with a Fischl charge attack. Then I can burst with Chevreuse, so that activates the overloaded. And since I'm not using the skill with Chevreuse, then I don't need to worry about her being buffed by Bennett. So Fischl charge attack, then Chevreuse burst and skill, then Bennett skill and burst, then Fischl skill, then go to town with Linny. So again, it would take way too long to go over every single character rotation, but hopefully that gets you thinking about how to construct the rotations properly. And if you're having trouble, join our Discord. It's linked in the description. It's a very nice Discord. There'll be a lot of people there that can help you. And while you're down there, please subscribe. It really helps out the channel a lot. For value and power ranking, where do I think that Chevreuse lands in terms of value and power ranking? For value, I think she's not a character that you should wish for. Like, she's a 4-star. I don't think that you should like go for C6 Chevreuse as a 4-star, even if she is the ceiling team for Raiden or for Linny, or I think those are the two, or for maybe Yai. Those are, I would say, the 3 characters that have the potential for her to be a ceiling team for. I'm not saying she is. I'm saying that those are the 3 teams I could see her being a ceiling team for. And even then, it's in certain Abyss rotations, not in all types of content. So even if she is the ceiling team, it's not so far above the ceiling or below the ceiling, if it is below, that it's worth going for a C6 Chevreuse. It's not the way Farazan is best in slot for Zhao and Wanderer team. It gives these characters another very strong option that may be best in slot for certain Abyss rooms and rotation. However, I do think she has pretty good value to build if you already happen to get her, because what her biggest downside is, she doesn't work with Hydro characters, who are the strongest characters in the game, and Pyro characters often want to use Hydro characters, but for characters that don't use Hydro, that's why I think that Linny and Raiden and Yai have a chance, because they don't use Hydro characters. So, but if you happen to have her, whether it's at C0 or at C6, I think there's value in building her either as a new player, because she's so cheap to build. So you kind of might as well build her and have her as a strong option. The more constellations you have, of course, the better, because her C6 actually is Giga Crack. And that's where I want to talk about power. For power, if you want to see my full tier list, go check out my tier list video, but I would put her at C0 in the B tier, closer to the higher end of B tier, which for those of you who don't know, my tier lists go F, A, B, so there's no double S or triple S or whatever. But I'd put her in the B tier, and when she's at C6, I would definitely put her in the A tier. I don't think she's an S tier unit at C0, but I think she might be pretty high up there on the A tier. I think there's a chance that she competes with Fischl, with Sucrose, with Shangling when she's at C6, and I think that's pretty darn awesome. It's possible that she's a little bit worse than all these units, but I think it's also possible she's just as good. It'll just take more testing. Again, I tested her a lot, played her for 6+ hours, but it's only one day, so what can you do? But don't feel like you need to go out and get her, but also if you got her, then great, and you've got a new fun toy to play with, and I'm really excited to play her more. For future prospects, I do think that she is one of the characters with the most future potential. So far, there have been no characters, except for maybe Linny, that have been made even with her thinking about her in mind. I'm not saying Linny was made for her or something like that, or she was made for Linny. It's just that they might have had the conception that these characters are going to be out within relatively close to the same time as each other, and so they may have had her kit in mind when designing Linny. But future Pyro and Electro characters will have her in mind. And so I definitely think that her ceiling has yet to be discovered, whether it's going to be Cloran, whether it's going to be Arlecchino, whether it's going to be the Pyro Nation, whether it's going to be Gaming, who knows? I do think that she has a lot of future potential. I highly do not advise going for her just because of your future potential. Again, 4-stars are notoriously awful to wish for, but I do think that she has potential to be really good with future characters. And finally, in the overworld, I think she's not that great of an overworld character. She needs a lot of ER, even at C6. Overloaded, just not that great of a reaction in general in the overworld. She's probably one of the worst overworld characters in the game, but I think that's okay. Like, not every character has to be good everywhere. It's okay for a character to be more of a bossing character. That being said, versus, you know, some bosses, like trash mobs and exploration isn't everything. Sometimes the overworld has to do with like the whale. I think she's probably a great character against weekly bosses, whether it's the whale or other characters. So it's not like she's useless in the overworld. It's just that when you're dealing with trash mobs and domains where characters are being knocked around and you can't use her properly with Animo characters, with Hydro characters, it definitely restricts what you can do for mob. And as far as design, she is one of my characters that I don't like her color scheme as much. I really love her outfit, but I don't love the purple hair. I don't love the eye pat. But I think it's cool. Like, at least it's different, but it feels like maybe a tiny bit hacky or something. I don't know, but I don't hate it. It's not my least favorite in the whole world either. So let me know your thoughts for Chevreuse. Let me know if you got her, how your wishes went, and take care, and bye for now.